All right, guys. So we're now on the final stretch of this. And again, I told you it was a long lecture. Again, if we had 90 minutes in the class, we would have finished this in one sitting, but we're going to be piecing this together. We're now going to look at the Red Army, the occupation of Eastern Europe. And I, as a historian, really am going to overly emphasize this as the cause. I just got done teaching the freshmen about the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, and the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, Russian army's occupation of Eastern Europe, especially Poland, dictated the peace process. Well, I think this is the exact same image. The Red Army is going to occupy all of these countries. The only country in the East that they don't occupy is literally Yugoslavia. And the reason they don't, and that's Marshal Tito. I'm not sure if we're going to do that quote unquote case study in that because it's really not for our text. I'm going to go back to my blue card to ensure that, but I just want to point out this Iron Curtain is going to exclude Yugoslavia because Yugoslavia was able to gain victory over the Nazis apart from Soviet support. The Red Army is going to dominate the sphere of influence. It's going to be unquestioned. And this is when George Kennan makes his long telegram public. And he publishes this in Foreign Affairs magazine, which I believe was probably much more well-read back then. In today's world, only the nerds like me may pick that up. But Kennan's, we call it the Mr. X article. So he writes it so that uses a pen name so people don't know it's him. And this was all thumbs up by Truman to allow it to be published. And it was a condensed version of the long telegram. And the whole point of Kennan was to illustrate in his article that there is a need for containment, that the containment is not just about the United States creating their own sphere of influence. It is in fact created to counter what the Red Army is doing. The point was to inform the public of what was quote unquote really happening. And this is going to create that fear and aggression that's going to seem to define the boundaries of the Cold War, and not just the physical boundaries, but it's going to define the boundaries from here on out. The American public will consistently be fearful. And if you don't remember, I am a Cold War baby. I was born in 1969. My teenage years are in the 1980s, at really the height of the Cold War, if you will, as about to collapse. The only other point that was higher containment would be obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I remember in the 1980s that I had this feeling that the Soviet Union was evil, that the individual people were evil. When I watched James Bond movies, it always was the evil Soviet spies. So I want to point out that that fear is very prevalent and invasive through the American point of view. Now, this really puts in the Czechoslovakian coup. This is where, when I read this, I was a little caught off guard that your book really barely mentions this. The Czechoslovakian coup of 1948 is a moment that you can identify that the Cold War is perfectly defined. So what's going on? February 1948, Stalin utilized the Red Army to quash a Czech independence movement. President Beneš, as you saw in your reading, was popularly elected. He was a socialist, not a communist. And he was standing strong that Czechoslovakia had been a democracy before the Munich conference. And really, Beneš is he's really arguing that they can resist this. Czechoslovakia has never been part of the Russian influence. Czechoslovakians are they're not Slavs. Czechs are definitely not Slavs. So there's really no connection politically, ethnically, culturally, anything. And they were the only democracy. Well, so Stalin's like, wait a minute, you're liberated, you have the Red Army, I've done you this favor, so now you must play my game. Well, at that moment, Beneš begins to realize this looks a lot like the Munich conference. He realized that what's going to happen here? Am I going to take a stand? Am I going to die? And in turns, he does surrender at the height of this conflict, where he realizes that he is about to die if he resists. He withdraws and he flees the country. And in fact, you now have a little Stalin put in place. Well, this Czech coup absolutely violated the Declaration of Liberated Europe. It rejected any element of self-determination and, in fact, Czechoslovakia had began to request Marshall Plan money. And this is what initiated this little purge, if you will, at this moment. And this is where Truman is going to use this to get Congress to pass the Marshall Plan. Truman goes and says, guys, I promise you, I've told this Republican Congress that Stalin is in opposition to liberty. Stalin is in opposition to self-determination. He is violating the same agreements that he signed with us at Potsdam. He's violating the essence of the United Nations. So therefore, we must act now. If we do not act now, we will see all of Europe. At this moment, it's a fait accompli. Czechoslovakia has been sacrificed. Czechoslovakia is now part of the Soviet sphere. There is no question about that. And Truman is going to use this opportunity to justify the Marshall Plan for the rebuilding of the rest of Western Europe. This is a political cartoon that comes out of it. Stalin's really evil. He is creating a web, if you will, of deceit. I love this. This is probably one of the Lowe's last political cartoons. If you don't remember, Lowe's cartoons were very popular during the 1930s and into the 1940s. And what we see here, we see this political cartoon where who's next to be liberated from freedom, comrade? You have a whole bunch of you who are able to enlarge this. You'd see all these different countries. Czechoslovakia, its liberation has been defeated. They're no longer a free state. And that's going to lead us really to this Berlin blockade. And I'm not going to go into this until later. But what I want to point out here, guys, is when we look at this, yes, containment is a significant part in the creation of the boundaries of the Cold War. But I'm going to argue from the Orthodox view, the whole reason for containment was to keep the Soviet Union in check. That the Soviet Union, under Stalin's leadership, and it's really Stalin, not the Soviet Union, Stalin alone, under his paranoid perspective, he begins to create policies that was counter to the stability of Europe. And Truman, through an ideological point of view, realized he had to act. You could argue maybe Churchill himself is the one that dictates all this. But remember, guys, by 1946, he's really out of political power. He is only going to be a pawn used by Truman to convey the message. But that's where we have it. I would argue by this time the Czech coup, the Grand Alliance has now collapsed. The ashes now have fallen from World War II, and we are now on this Cold War conflict. And that's going to what leads us right to the Berlin blockade that we're going to take 2 or 3 class periods to really delve into. So with that said, I hope this lecture finishes up well, and you guys have a great day.